The moving truck arrived at 7 in the morning, earlier than Evelyn Hart had expected. She heard it before she saw it, the low diesel rumble cutting through the October quiet of their Burlington street, the kind of sound that does not belong on a Tuesday morning in a neighborhood where nothing has changed in 30 years. She was already dressed. She had been dressed since 5. She stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee she had not touched and watched two men in gray uniforms climb out of the cab. They did not look at the house with any particular interest. They had seen 100 houses like this one. They would see 100 more. Douglas came downstairs at 7:15. He was wearing the blue blazer he reserved for meetings, which struck Evelyn as a strange choice for the day your marriage of 48 years ends in a parking transaction. He carried a clipboard with a yellow legal pad attached, and on that yellow pad was a numbered list. She could see it from across the kitchen. She did not need to read it. She had watched him write it 3 weeks ago at that same kitchen table, hunched over it, the way he used to hunch over engineering drawings, back when hunching over things still meant something. Item number 1 had been the sectional sofa in the living room. She remembered that. She had not been able to stop herself from watching his pen move. He did not say good morning. He walked past her toward the front door, paused with his hand on the knob, and said without turning around, "They'll start in the living room. If there's anything personal you want to set aside before they get to it, now would be the time." Evelyn looked at the back of his head, at the white hair she had watched go from brown to gray to white over 5 decades, at the particular set of his shoulders that she had once been able to read like weather, that had once told her when he was tired or worried or quietly proud of something he had not figured out how to say. She could not read them anymore. They had become a stranger's shoulders somewhere in the last 2 years, and she had not noticed the exact moment it happened. "I know what's mine," she said. He opened the door and went outside. The 2 men in gray uniforms were professional and efficient and utterly without feeling, which was, Evelyn supposed, exactly what the situation called for. They worked through the living room first, as Douglas had said they would, wrapping the sectional sofa in moving blankets, carrying out the side tables she had bought at an estate sale in 2003, lifting the floor lamp that had stood in the corner beside the reading chair for so long that there was a faint ring worn into the hardwood beneath it. Number 31 on the list, she imagined, or perhaps 40. She had stopped trying to count. She moved through the house slowly, not watching the men directly, but aware of them the way you are aware of water rising in a room. The wedding photograph came down from the hallway wall. The oak dining table was disassembled with a mechanical efficiency that seemed almost violent in its indifference. The bookshelves were emptied, though Douglas had left the books themselves in a cardboard box in the hallway with a piece of masking tape that said Evelyn in his block handwriting, as though that small concession settled something. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long time. 48 years of mornings in that room. 48 years of his breathing beside her in the dark of the particular creak the floorboard made just to the left of the closet of the way. The October light came through the east window and landed in a rectangle on the wall above the headboard that she had always meant to hang something in and never did. She had always meant to do a great many things. The moving men came past her with the headboard. She stepped aside. She found Douglas in the driveway around 9:30, standing beside the new sedan that had appeared in their lives 8 months ago, and that she had understood even then was not really about transportation. He was reviewing his list, making small check marks with a pen. He did not look up when she came to stand a few feet from him. "The wooden box," she said, "the one on the bedroom shelf, the small cedar one with the brass latch." He looked up then. "My mother's letters are in it," she said. "It wasn't on any list. It was on the shelf before we moved into this house. It was mine before I was yours." Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt exactly, more like the brief arithmetic of a man calculating whether an objection is worth the time it would cost him. One of the moving men had already carried the box to the truck, and Douglas knew it, and Evelyn knew he knew it. "Go get it," he said to the man nearest him. The man retrieved it. He handed it to Evelyn without ceremony, and she took it with both hands, and the cedar smell of it reached her before anything else did, the smell of her mother's house in Milbrook County, the smell of a different life. She held the box against her chest and said nothing more. Douglas made a small notation on his yellow pad and turned back to the truck. There was something she had noticed about him in the past 2 years, a thing she had turned over in her mind during the long hours she had spent trying to understand how they had arrived at this particular Tuesday morning in October. Douglas Hart had built things his entire life. He had designed bridges and overpasses and retaining walls throughout northern Vermont for 30 years, and his particular genius had been for load-bearing structures, for understanding precisely how much weight any given thing could hold before it failed. He had been very good at it. The certificates on the study wall said so. The firm that bore his name for 2 decades said so. But the firm no longer bore his name. In the spring of 2020, his partners had voted to restructure and sell, and they had done it in a single meeting to which Douglas had been invited, but whose outcome had already been decided before he walked into the room. He had come home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and said nothing for a very long time, and Evelyn had made tea and set it in front of him and waited, and he had finally looked up at her and said, "I should have seen it coming." And she had said, "You couldn't have known." And they had both understood even then that they were talking about different things. He had not been the same man after that. Not worse exactly, just different in a way that she could not name until much later when she understood that what had broken was not his pride or his confidence, but his sense of being necessary. Douglas Hart had arranged his entire interior life around the certainty that things required him. The firm had required him. The house had required him. She had required him. And when one of those things removed itself from the equation, he had looked at the others differently. He had looked at her differently. Sandra Kellner had been at the restructuring firm's farewell dinner. Evelyn had been introduced to her once briefly in the parking lot of a restaurant, a woman with careful posture and the particular attentiveness of someone who understands that listening closely is a skill most people mistake for affection. Evelyn had thought nothing of it at the time. She thought a great deal of it later. The divorce had not been announced so much as installed. Papers had arrived then, a lawyer's letter, then a series of meetings to which Evelyn had gone with a growing feeling of unreality, as though she were watching someone else's life being taken apart with a set of tools she did not own. The house was in Douglas's name, had been since 1987 when they refinanced, and a document was placed in front of her during a week when her mother had just been diagnosed, and she had signed without reading, because Douglas had said it was routine, and she had trusted him the way you trust someone whose shoulders you have been reading for 20 years. The cars were in his name. The accounts were joint but weighted toward his contributions in ways the court had apparently found persuasive. She had been left with 2 suitcases, a cardboard box of books, her mother's cedar box, and a sealed envelope Douglas handed her in the driveway at 10:45. "There's some cash here," he said, "to help you get started." She took the envelope. It felt thin. She did not open it then. "Get started where?" she asked. He hesitated. Just one beat, just the smallest pause. But she had known this man for half a century, and she felt it the way you feel a step that isn't there. "That's up to you," he said. He stepped back toward the car. He adjusted his cuff. He said, "Take care of yourself, Evelyn," in the tone of a man leaving a business meeting that had gone adequately, and he got in and he drove away without looking back. She stood in the driveway and watched the car until it was gone. The October air moved through the maple at the edge of the lawn, and the leaves came down the way they always did at this time of year, unhurried and indifferent to the fact that anything at all had changed. The house behind her was not her house. The driveway beneath her feet was not her driveway. She was 74 years old, and she was standing on a public sidewalk with 2 suitcases and a cardboard box and a cedar box and a sealed envelope, and she was trying to remember if she had eaten breakfast. She sat down on the curb. The concrete was cold through her skirt. A car passed without slowing. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something it had decided was worth barking at. She opened the envelope. $3,200 in 50s. She counted it once, then folded it back and put it in her coat pocket. Enough for a few months in a motel. Enough for a plane ticket somewhere, though she could not immediately think of anywhere she needed to go. She had lived in Burlington for 47 years. She had grown up an hour north of here. Her mother had grown up an hour north of here. Her mother. She looked at the cedar box sitting on top of the nearest suitcase where she had set it when she sat down. She had not opened it in years. She knew what was in it because she had put the things in there herself after Francis Ward died, after the house in Milbrook County was sold, after everything that needed doing had been done, and there was nothing left but the small, private objects of a woman's life. Letters, a few photographs, some papers. And at the very bottom, tucked against the wood like something left deliberately in a known location, a small piece of folded paper that Evelyn had found and read, and then folded back and set aside during a week when she did not have the capacity for anything more. She lifted the lid of the cedar box now. The smell hit her first, the same smell as always, cedar, and something faintly floral that she had never been able to identify her mother's house in concentrated form. She moved aside the bundle of letters, the photographs, the folded documents from the estate. And there at the bottom was the piece of paper exactly where she had left it. Her mother's handwriting, neat and deliberate, the same cursive that had written her school lunch notes and her birthday cards and the little instructions she used to leave on the kitchen counter when she had errands in town. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then you have the key. Call Margaret Calloway in Milbrook. She knows what to do. And below that, a phone number. A landline number, the kind with an exchange that told you it was Milbrook County, written in the same ink as the rest. Evelyn read it twice. Then she looked at the bottom of the cedar box, and there in the corner, half hidden under the edge of the liner paper, was something she had not noticed before. Something small and solid and cold to the touch. She reached in, and her fingers closed around it. A brass key, old, worn, smooth at the edges, its surface the color of honey gone dark. She held it up in the October light and looked at it the way you look at something you recognize but cannot immediately place the way certain objects carry their history on their surface without explaining it. And then she remembered. Not all at once, not as a single clear image, but in pieces the way memory actually works. Pine trees, the particular sound of wind through spruce, a porch with a screen door that never quite latched. Her mother's voice calling her name from somewhere inside, the voice of a woman in her 40s who did not yet know all the things that were still coming for her. A small wooden cabin in Milbrook County, 40 minutes from the town center, at the end of a dirt road that the county maps did not bother to name. She had been there last when she was 31 years old. She had met Douglas by then. She was already becoming a different version of herself, a version organized around his life, and his name and his addresses, and the cabin had receded the way things recede when you stop looking at them. Not disappeared, just stepped back, waited. She had not thought about it in years, not in decades. Douglas had certainly never thought about it because Douglas had never known about it in any specific way, the way you don't specifically know about a chair in a room you've never been in. It existed outside the perimeter of their shared life. It had not been relevant. It had not therefore existed for him. She sat on that curb for another moment and looked at the key in her hand and understood something very clearly. This was the one thing that had not been on the yellow legal pad. This was the one thing no court had been asked about, and no lawyer had thought to name, and no moving man had been sent to collect. Not because anyone had protected it, because no one had remembered it was there. She put the key in her coat pocket next to the folded envelope with the $3,200. Then she took out her phone. The number from her mother's note was for a landline. She dialed it anyway because her mother had told her to, and because her mother had in her experience usually known what she was talking about. It rang 4 times, then someone picked up. Calloway Law, Milbrook County. A woman's voice, middle-aged, businesslike. Evelyn's voice came out smaller than she intended. My name is Evelyn Hart. My mother was Frances Ward. 3 seconds of silence. Then the voice changed, not dramatically, not the way voices change in films, but in the way that a room changes when someone opens a window, a shift in pressure, an intake of something new. Where are you right now? Burlington. I'm sitting on a curb on Elmwood Avenue. Are you all right? I think so. I'm not entirely certain. Another pause, shorter this time. Your mother came to see me in 1987, the day after she transferred the cabin property into your name. She sat in my office and she said, I am telling you, these are her exact words. She said, if my daughter ever calls this number, it means she needs a place to stand. Help her find her footing. I have been waiting 37 years for this call, Mrs. Hart. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. The dog down the block was still barking. The maple leaves were still falling. Somewhere behind her, the house that had been her home for 47 years sat empty of everything that had made it feel like one. There's something I need to know, Evelyn said. The cabin, is it still mine with the divorce, the property division, all of it? Did they take that too? She heard the sound of a keyboard. Papers. The cabin at the end of Route 12 in Milbrook County transferred by Frances Irene Ward to Evelyn Marie Ward, October 1987. Correct. Yes. It was never listed in any joint property filing. Vermont recognizes separately held premarital assets in equitable distribution proceedings when they are not explicitly incorporated into shared holdings. If the cabin was in your name before your marriage, and if it was never restructured into a joint account or used as collateral, then no, they did not take it. They did not know to ask. Another pause. Don't sign anything else. Can you get yourself to Milbrook? I'll find the bus schedule. Good. Come to my office when you arrive. I'll be here. Then just before the line went quiet, Mrs. Hart, don't lose that key. Evelyn looked at the pocket where she had put it. I won't. She got to her feet. Her knees protested as they did now, as they had begun to do in the last few years, with the particular persistence of a thing that intends to be heard. She picked up one suitcase, then the other. The cardboard box of books she left on the curb because books are heavy and she was 74 and she could not carry everything. The bus from Burlington to Milbrook County left at 2:15. She had 4 hours. She walked 3 blocks to a diner she knew and ordered coffee and a bowl of oatmeal and sat in a window booth and watched the street while she ate. She thought about Frances Ward, who had walked into a lawyer's office in 1987 with a piece of property and a specific instruction and the patience to wait for a phone call that might never come. Her mother had been 53 in 1987, younger than Evelyn felt right now, old enough to understand that the things you build for the people you love are not always the things they can see. She thought about Douglas and his yellow legal pad and the numbered list that had accounted for everything he believed mattered. She thought about how that list had been a kind of self-portrait, precise and complete and utterly revealing about what its author had chosen to value. And she thought about how the most important thing in her life right now was something he had not known to number. The coffee was good. She ordered a second cup. At 2:15, she was on the bus. At 4:40, the bus let her off at the Milbrook County Station, a building smaller than most gas stations. And she stood on the platform with her 2 suitcases in the cooling afternoon air and got her bearings. She had not been here in 43 years. The main street had a different pharmacy and a different hardware store, but the same general sense of a town that had decided exactly how large it wanted to be and had declined all invitations to become otherwise. Meg Calloway's office was 4 blocks from the station above a real estate agency, up a narrow staircase that smelled of old wood and radiator heat. The woman behind the desk was small and precise, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She stood when Evelyn came in. Sit down, Meg said, and it was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who has assessed a situation and identified the most useful immediate action. You've had a long day. I've had a long year, Evelyn said and sat. Meg confirmed what she had said on the phone more carefully this time with documents spread across the desk. The cabin had been transferred in October 1987, 6 months before Evelyn and Douglas were married in Burlington. The transfer had been recorded at the Milbrook County Registry of Deeds. It appeared nowhere in the divorce proceedings because neither Douglas's attorneys nor Evelyn's own brief representation during the process had gone looking for premarital separately held assets in another county. The divorce had been handled in Burlington on Burlington terms, and the cabin existed as it always had, in its own quiet corner of the world, unremarked upon and therefore untouched. Your mother was very careful, Meg said. She said it the way you say something that is both a compliment and a statement of fact. She was always careful, Evelyn said. I think I forgot that. Meg looked at her steadily over the top of the reading glasses. There's a property tax account that's been maintained automatically from an escrow she set up. The cabin has had the taxes paid current every year. She paused. She set that up the same day she transferred the property. 1987. Evelyn did not say anything for a moment. She set up a tax escrow in 1987 and never told me. She told me, Meg said simply. She said you'd come when you needed it. She didn't want administrative problems to be the reason you couldn't. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. Outside, the October light was failing fast the way it does in Vermont. In the second week of October, the sky going from blue to gray to a particular deep violet in what feels like no time at all. The key works, Meg asked. Evelyn took it from her coat pocket and set it on the desk between them. Meg looked at it. She gave me a copy when she transferred the property. I still have it if yours doesn't work. I think it will work, Evelyn said. She did not know why she felt certain about this. She felt it anyway. She took the bus as far as the Route 12 junction, then walked. The last mile and a half was along a dirt road that the county had apparently not graded since the last time she had been on it, which said a great deal about the county's feelings regarding roads that went nowhere. Anyone was trying to go. The suitcases were difficult. She stopped twice to rest her arms and once to rest her legs, standing in the near dark with the pine trees close on either side and the smell of cold earth and spruce, needle and something else, something she could not name immediately and then could. Home. Not her home in Burlington, the home she had spent 47 years inside. Something earlier than that, something that had been home before she knew enough to call it anything. The cabin came into view when she rounded the last bend. It was smaller than she remembered the way all places from childhood are smaller. The porch tilted slightly to the left, the roof dark with years of moss and weather. But the structure was sound. She could see that, even in the failing light. Her mother had built things to last, or had paid people who built things to last, and the cabin had lasted. She climbed the porch steps carefully. The boards creaked, but held. She put the key in the lock. It resisted for a moment, the mechanism stiff with decades of disuse, and then with a sound that seemed much larger than its actual volume, in the complete silence of the October woods it turned. She pushed the door open. The air inside was cool and still and faintly dusty, carrying beneath the dust the same smell as the cedar box, the same compressed history, the same sense of a life that had been lived here carefully and with intention. She used her phone's light to find the lamp switch on the wall just inside the door. Miraculously, it worked. A warm light filled the cabin's main room, and she stood in the doorway and looked at it. The furniture was still there under white sheets that had yellowed with age but remained intact. The old wooden table in the center of the room, the stone fireplace with a stack of cut wood beside it, the shelves along the east wall lined with books and glass jars and objects she remembered without being able to name all of them. The same braided rug on the floor, faded now, but still there. All of it still there, like a room in a story that has been waiting for its next chapter. She set her suitcases down just inside the door. She walked slowly to the center of the room and stood on the braided rug and turned in a slow circle. The lamp cast its warm light across the covered shapes of things. Outside the small windows, the dark had finished arriving, and she was alone in a cabin at the end of a dirt road in Milbrook County, Vermont, with everything she owned. And for the first time all day, the feeling in her chest was not the tight, hollow feeling of loss. It was something else, quieter than relief, steadier than hope. She was about to carry her suitcase to the back bedroom when the light from her phone, which she was holding in her other hand, caught something she had not noticed from the doorway. On the surface of the wooden trunk at the foot of the bed, visible through the open door of the small bedroom, something pale sat precisely in the center. She walked toward it and picked it up. An envelope sealed, its paper gone slightly amber with age. And on the front, in Frances Ward's careful hand, 4 words. For Evelyn, when ready. Not when the time comes. Not an instruction, when ready. Her mother had known there would be a difference between the two. She held the envelope and looked at it for a long moment, and she did not open it. Not yet. The night was long and there was wood beside the fireplace, and she needed to figure out if the flue was clear before she tried to light anything. Because she was 74 years old, and she was practical, and she had learned tonight that there was still a great deal left to do. She put the envelope on the table where she could see it from everywhere in the room. Then she went to look at the fireplace. She did not open the envelope that first night or the second. She told herself it was because she had more immediate problems to address, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she understood in some wordless way that the envelope was the kind of thing you open when you are ready to receive what is in it, and she was not yet ready. She needed to earn it first. She was not sure how she knew this. She knew it anyway. The first immediate problem was the wood stove. The fireplace she had examined that first night was ornamental, at best the flue partially blocked, and the firebox too shallow for the kind of sustained heat a Vermont November required. But the wood stove in the kitchen corner was a different matter. It was a cast iron model, old and heavy, and built when things were built to outlast the people who bought them. And when she opened its door and looked inside with her phone's light, she saw that it was intact. The question was the chimney pipe, which ran up through the kitchen ceiling and presumably through the roof, and which she could not see and could not assess without daylight and something to stand on. She found a step ladder in the lean-to shed attached to the back of the cabin, which also contained a hand axe, 2 pairs of work gloves worn thin at the fingertips, a collection of mason jars in varying sizes, and a 50-pound bag of water softener salt that had hardened into a single mass from decades of humidity. She left the salt. In the morning, she climbed the ladder and examined what she could of the chimney pipe from inside. What she found was a blockage about 4 feet up a dense mass of debris that had accumulated over 40 years of vacancy. She cleared it over the course of 2 days using a length of wire she straightened from a coat hanger and a flashlight she had bought at the Milbrook hardware store. It was slow and uncomfortable work, and twice she came down the ladder faster than she intended because her arms gave out, and on the afternoon of the second day, she stood in the kitchen with soot on her hands, in her face and the front of her coat, and looked at the clean section of pipe with the particular satisfaction of someone who has done a difficult thing without any help from anyone. She lit the stove that evening. It drew well. The heat came in a way she felt in her hands first, and then in her feet, and then slowly room by room through the cabin's small interior. She sat down in the chair nearest the stove and did not move for a long time. The next problem was water. The well was hand pump, operated the pump, installed sometime in the 1970s, based on its design, and it was still functional, but stiff from disuse. The handle requiring more force than her shoulders found comfortable. She worked it every morning until it moved more easily, which took about a week, and during that week she bought water at the Milbrook General Store in gallon jugs and carried them back on the bus. She did not complain about this to anyone because there was no one to complain to, which turned out to be clarifying in a way she had not anticipated. When you cannot complain, you tend to solve things faster. It was during her third trip to the general store on a Thursday in late October that she first saw Pete Dawson's truck. It was parked in the loading area behind the store, a dark green pickup that had been repainted at some point and was now the color of weathered pine. And the man loading crates into its bed was large and unhurried and wore a baseball cap so faded that its original color was impossible to determine. She did not speak to him that day, but she saw his truck twice more in the following week, once at the feed store on Route 12 and once parked at the end of a dirt road 2 priorities north of the cabin. And on a Tuesday morning in the first week of November, she came out to the front of the property to check the mailbox. She had filed a forwarding address with the post office primarily so that she would know if anything legal was coming, and found him standing at the edge of her driveway. He was looking at the well housing. "Can I help you?" she said. He turned around. He was perhaps 45, with the kind of face that had spent considerable time outdoors and showed it, and he had the unhurried quality of someone who is rarely surprised by anything, but is willing to observe what happens next. "Pete Dawson," he said. "I run the produce delivery for this part of the county." He looked at the well housing again. That pump is pulling from the same aquifer as my storage building, 2 properties north. I saw the smoke from your chimney last week and came to see who was here. Evelyn Hart, she said, the property belongs to me. It was transferred to me by my mother in 1987. He looked at her steadily. Francis Ward's daughter. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the cabin the way a man looks at something he is recalculating. Francis didn't mention a daughter in all the years I delivered to her. She was private about some things. He accepted this. The pump giving you trouble. It was stiff, it's loosening up. He nodded. He looked at the well housing one more time, then looked back at her. The aquifer runs under 3 properties on this road. Long as nobody's running irrigation or commercial volume, there's enough for everyone. He paused. You planning commercial volume? Not yet, she said. Possibly eventually. He took this in without visible reaction. I deliver 3 times a week to homesteads in the county. Produce dry goods, some specialty items. If you need supplies, I can add you to a route. Another pause. My father delivered to Francis for 8 years. She looked at him. He was not offering this as a sentiment. He was stating a fact the way you state a fact when the fact is relevant to a practical arrangement. What are your rates? She asked. He named them. They were fair. She said she would think about it, which she did for about 48 hours before leaving a note in the mailbox with her first order. She opened the envelope on a Friday evening in the second week of November after she had eaten dinner and after the stove had settled into its nighttime rhythm, and after she had sat with her hands in her lap for long enough that she was certain she was not opening it out of impatience or anxiety, but out of genuine readiness. The paper was thin and had the texture of something that has been folded and unfolded many times, though she did not remember ever having unfolded it before. It was a letter 3 pages written in her mother's handwriting at a density that suggested Francis had known she had a great deal to say and was not certain how much time she had to say it. She read it slowly. Her mother had married at 22 and left her marriage at 31 in 1961, when leaving a marriage in a small Vermont county meant a specific kind of social reckoning that Francis Ward had apparently endured with the same pragmatic directness she brought to everything else. She had taken her daughter in the cabin, which had been a wedding gift from her own mother, and she had built a life there selling preserves and dried herbs and homemade goods at the Milbrook County Farmers Market, and later to 2 local stores, and eventually to private buyers. And she had done this for nearly 20 years until Evelyn was grown and the market changed and Frances herself was in her 50s and the work had become harder and the returns smaller and she had let it wind down. But she had never let the cabin go. And when she transferred it to Evelyn in 1987, she had done 2 things that the letter now explained. She had paid off the remaining property taxes and set up the escrow to maintain them forward. And she had taken the business ledger, the customer list, the contact notes, the supply records, every piece of practical documentation from 20 years of running a small food production business out of a cabin in Milbrook County, and she had put it in a waterproof tin box and put that box under the floorboard beside the wood stove with a note telling Evelyn where to find it. The note separate from this letter was with the key. Evelyn read this passage twice. Then she stood up, moved to the wood stove, and looked at the floor around it. She pressed her foot against each board near the stove's base until she found one that gave slightly differently than the others. She worked the edge up with a kitchen knife. Underneath, in a tin box sealed with electrical tape that had dried to a brittle crust, she found everything her mother had described. The ledger was a standard composition notebook with a red cover, its pages dense with her mother's handwriting. Customer names, addresses, preferences, purchase histories going back to 1962. Price points, seasonal demand patterns, notes about which families preferred what flavors, which ones bought in bulk, which ones paid immediately, and which ones needed 30 days. At the back, in a different pen, in what appeared to be a later hand, her mother had written, Harold Stinson, Milbrook General Route 12. He will pay fair price but will test you first. Do not let him have exclusivity. Circle this. The word circle was underlined. The name Harold Stinson was circled in red. Evelyn sat on the kitchen floor with the ledger in her lap and read it from the beginning. It took most of the night. Pete Dawson knocked on the door of the cabin on a Thursday morning in late November, which was not one of his delivery days, and Evelyn knew from this that something had shifted in whatever calculation he kept about people and their reliability. "I wanted to ask you something," he said from the porch. She opened the door wider. He came in and stood in the kitchen in the careful way of a large man in a small space, his hat in his hands. He looked at the tin box on the table open with the ledger beside it and several pages of notes she had made from it. "Frances's records," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, she left them under the floor." He looked at them for a moment. "My father is in there," he said, "in the contact list." "Tom Dawson, Route 9, yes. Your father supplied her with apples, late harvest pears, and occasionally rhubarb. She noted that he was reliable and did not inflate prices in a shortage year." She paused. "She wrote he is a man who understands that the people you deal with honestly will still be dealing with you in 10 years. Pete was quiet for a moment. He set his hat on the table. "She said that about my father. She wrote it in 1974. He looked at the window, then back at the ledger. "What did you want to ask me?" Evelyn said. He refocused. "Harold Stinson, you know his name?" "From the ledger, yes. He's been running the specialty foods section at his Milbrook store for 30 years. Since Frances stopped supplying him, he's gone through 4 different local producers, and none of them lasted more than a season." Pete picked up his hat again. "I know him. I can introduce you if you want, but I should tell you something first." "Tell me." "He'll test you. He won't say he's testing you. He'll make an ask that's slightly beyond what he thinks you can deliver, and he'll put a short deadline on it, and he'll watch how you respond." Frances knew this about him. "It's in the ledger." Evelyn looked at the ledger. "She wrote he will set a bar designed to reveal character." "That's Harold." Pete picked up his hat. "You want the introduction?" "Yes," she said, "but I want to look at the ledger for another week first." The introduction happened on a Wednesday in Harold Stinson's office at the back of his Route 12 store. Harold was 71 years old, a large man, with the physical authority of someone who had been the most competent person in most rooms he had entered for 50 years, and he looked at Evelyn with the careful, non-committal attention of a man who does not waste impressions. Pete sat to her left. He did not speak. He had come as an introduction and would not do more than that. "Frances Ward's daughter," Harold said. "Yes. She supplied me from 1968 to 1994. "I know, I've read the records." He looked at her steadily. "I've had 4 producers since Frances. None of them understood what she understood." "What did she understand?" He was quiet for a moment, as though deciding whether the question was genuine or rhetorical. "Consistency," he said finally. "She never sent me a product that was different from what she'd sent the week before. Customers came to rely on the flavor profile. That's not easy to achieve in small batch production." "No," Evelyn agreed. "It requires keeping records." He looked at the folder she had set on the desk in front of her. She opened it and slid a single sheet across to him. It was a production sheet she had prepared from her mother's recipes and her own testing over the preceding 2 weeks, showing yields, ingredient ratios, and consistency measurements for 3 products. Harold looked at it. He looked at it for longer than she had expected. 20 jars, he said. 3 varieties, your choice. 2 weeks. He looked up. "If my customers respond, we talk terms." "We can talk terms now," Evelyn said. "I'll deliver the 20 jars, but I'd like the terms established before I begin production." Harold looked at her. "Most suppliers don't ask for that. Most suppliers haven't read their mother's 30-year customer ledger." She paused. "Frances noted that you paid on delivery without dispute in every year of your arrangement with her except 1989, when there was a billing discrepancy, which she also noted was resolved within a week and never recurred. I'm not concerned about payment. I want the pricing agreed in advance because it clarifies both of our planning." Something shifted in Harold's expression. Not quite a smile. The specific expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular quality to appear in a room and has just seen it. They agreed on terms. The exclusivity clause, which appeared in the draft he produced at the end of the meeting, she declined. He did not argue. He had the clause removed before she left the office. The 20 jars took 12 days to produce. On the 12th day, the first batch of strawberry preserve had set incorrectly the result of a temperature variance she had not accounted for in the cabin's kitchen versus her mother's notations, which had been calibrated to a different stove. She discarded it, identified the adjustment required, and began again. Pete arrived at 7 in the evening of the day she realized the first batch had failed on his regular delivery, and she told him she needed more strawberries. He had a contact. By 10 that night, she had the fruit she needed. By 2 in the morning, the replacement jars were cooling on the rack. She went to bed and slept without difficulty. Carol Whitfield appeared at the cabin on a Thursday morning in December, 5 weeks after Evelyn had arrived in Milbrook. She had found the Esther's address through Meg, she said, without apology, which Evelyn appreciated more than she would have appreciated an apology. Carol had brought food, which was practical. She had also brought somewhat to Evelyn's surprise work clothes, because she had apparently decided in advance that she was going to be useful and had dressed accordingly. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee while the stove worked behind them. "I knew he was talking to lawyers," Carol said, "since April." "I know," Evelyn said. Carol looked at her. "You knew I knew. I suspected it. You were uncomfortable around me for the last several months. You're not usually uncomfortable." Carol put her mug down. "I'm sorry." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "I know you are. I also know that being sorry and being brave are different things and that you chose the easier one when it mattered. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Carol absorbed this. "No," she said, "you shouldn't." "But you're here now," Evelyn said, "and I have 40 jars to label this afternoon. Do you want to help or not?" Carol helped. She was not skilled at the labeling at first, her handwriting too large and inconsistent for the small jars, but she was willing to be corrected, and she improved over the course of the afternoon in a way that suggested she was someone who had not been given enough practical work to do for a long time. At the end of the afternoon, when the jars were labeled and boxed for the Friday delivery, Carol looked around the cabin with an expression Evelyn could not quite read. "You actually built something here," Carol said. "I'm building it," Evelyn corrected. Present tense. "Right." A pause. "I'm thinking about buying a place in Milbrook, something small." Evelyn poured the last of the coffee. "Route 8 has a few properties. Meg would know." Carol looked at her. "You wouldn't mind." "Why would I mind? I wasn't there when you needed someone to be there." "No," Evelyn said. "You weren't. But that was then, and this is now, and I've found that spending time on the difference between the two is expensive and not particularly productive." She set the coffee down. "Come on Thursdays if you want. There's always something that needs doing." It was Meg who told her about the paperwork issue on a Saturday in January when she came into the cabin with a file folder and a look on her face that Evelyn had learned to associate with news that was not catastrophic but required attention. A clerical error in the divorce filing had listed a property description that read, broadly might be interpreted to include unspecified additional holdings in Vermont counties. Douglas's attorney had apparently noticed it and sent a formal inquiry. Nothing had been filed in court, but the inquiry existed. Evelyn listened to the full explanation. Then she said, "What do I need to sign?" Meg produced a document. She read it aloud, every clause. It took an hour and 20 minutes. When she finished, Evelyn asked 2 questions, received answers that satisfied her, and signed. "Douglas asked about you," Meg said before she left. "Through his attorney. He asked if you were managing." Evelyn considered this. "What did his attorney say?" "His attorney said he had no information about your current circumstances." Meg paused, which was true at the time. "What would you say now if asked?" Meg looked at the bars on the shelf, at the ledger on the table, at the list of pending orders pinned to the wall beside the window. "I would say you are managing," she said, "in the way that some people manage and most people don't." In February, she mailed Douglas's $3,200 back to him. She put it in an envelope with no letter, no note, nothing but the money counted exactly as it had been given. She gave it to Pete to mail from the Milbrook post office because she did not want to drive to Burlington, and she did not think the gesture required explanation. Pete asked no questions. He mailed it. 2 weeks later, Pete mentioned in the course of a delivery that a man matching Douglas's description had been asking questions in Milbrook, at the hardware store, at the general store, about the cabin and who was living there. Evelyn was stacking jars on the shelf when he said this. She continued stacking them. Did he find what he was looking for? Hard to say, Pete said. He left without coming to the property. He'll come when he's ready, she said. Or he won't. She finished stacking the jars. The contract with Harold Stinson was a single page. Evelyn had expected more, had prepared herself for more the way you prepare yourself after years of learning that important documents always have more pages than seem necessary. But Harold ran his business the way men of a certain generation ran businesses in small Vermont counties, on the understanding that a complicated piece of paper is usually a sign that someone does not trust the person sitting across the table. And if you do not trust the person across the table, you should not be doing business with them at all. She read every word anyway. Harold watched her do it without impatience. He was a large man, 71 years old, with a particular physical solidity of someone who had spent decades lifting and carrying and standing in cold storage rooms, and he had the stillness that goes with that kind of body, the capacity to occupy a chair without fidgeting while you waited for something to happen. Pete Dawson sat to her left and looked at the middle distance with the expression he always wore when he was in a room where words were being exchanged and he had not been asked for his. The contract specified quantity, delivery schedule, and price per unit. It excluded exclusivity. That was the clause she had asked Meg to look at first 2 days before this meeting, when Meg had reviewed the draft Harold's office had sent over. He wants the exclusivity language, Meg had told her on the phone, her voice carrying the particular neutrality of a lawyer who has an opinion but is presenting facts first. It's standard for a supplier relationship at this volume. Take it out, Evelyn had said. A pause. He may push back. I know, take it out. Now Harold looked at her across the table as she set the contract down. She had a pen in her hand. She had not yet used it. The exclusivity clause, she said. Harold's expression did not change, which she had come to understand was how he registered that something had gotten his attention. What about it? It's not in here. No. You agreed to remove it? My office sent the revision this morning, yes? She looked at him. He looked at her. Pete continued to look at the middle distance. My mother never gave any single buyer control over her entire output, Evelyn said. She sold to 3 different accounts and kept a 4th reserved for walk-in customers at the cabin. She did that for 8 years and never had a shortage and never had a dispute. She paused. She was usually right about how to run things. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Frances turned down an exclusivity arrangement from me in 1994. I offered her a 20% premium. Evelyn had not known that. She kept her face still. What did she say? She said a woman who puts all her eggs in one basket has forgotten what happened the last time she trusted a basket. A beat. I thought about that for about a week, and then I decided she was correct. Something shifted in his expression, the faintest movement at the corners of his eyes. Sign the contract, Mrs. Hart. She signed it, walking out to Pete's truck afterward, the sign in copy folded in her coat pocket. Evelyn felt something she had not felt in the months since October, something different from the quiet satisfaction of completing a difficult thing or the relief of a problem resolved. It was larger than either of those. It was the specific feeling of having built something real, something that would still be standing tomorrow and the day after, something with her name on it. Her name, Ward's cabin, her mother's name, which had always been her name too, the name she had carried inside the other one through 48 years of being Mrs. Hart. Pete drove without speaking for the first mile, which was how he drove most miles. Then he said, Harold told me before you arrived that he was going to push for the exclusivity provision. Evelyn looked out the window at the bare November trees. I know. He just wanted to see if you'd hold. I know that too. Pete made a sound that might have been approval and might have been something more private than that, and did not say anything else for the rest of the drive. She was in the garden behind the cabin 2 days later, cutting back the dead growth on the herb beds before the first hard frost arrived when she heard a car on the dirt road. She heard it before she saw it because the pines bent the sound in a particular way along that last stretch of road, and she had come to know the acoustic geography of the place well enough to understand what sounds belonged and which ones did not. This one did not belong. It was too smooth. The engine had the low, refined hum of something new and expensive, a sound designed to suggest that the person inside had arranged their life so that nothing rough would reach them. She straightened up slowly, her back registering the movement in the way backs do at 74, and turned toward the road. The car was a dark blue sedan, well-kept Vermont plates. It came to a stop at the edge of the property where the dirt road widened into the rough gravel that served as her parking area. The engine went quiet. She did not move. She stood in the garden with the pruning shears in her hand and watched the driver's door open. Douglas got out. He looked older than she remembered, which was strange because she had seen him 4 months ago, had stood 5 feet from him on the driveway of their house and watched him get into a car and drive away. But 4 months can do a great deal to a person when those 4 months involve a reversal they had not anticipated, and the man who walked around the front of the sedan and stood at the edge of her property looked like someone who had recently discovered that certainty is a more fragile material than it appears. He was wearing a good coat. He always wore a good coat. But his posture was different, a degree or two less upright than she remembered the slight forward lean of a man who has been spending time looking at things that are lower than eye level. He looked at the cabin, at the garden, at the small wooden table she had set up near the front porch with its rows of labeled jars, at the hand-painted sign above the porch ward's cabin, at the evidence which was everywhere of a life that had been built and was continuing to be built methodically and without his participation. Then he looked at her. "Evelyn," he said. "Douglas." He put his hands in his coat pockets and came forward a few steps, stopping at the edge of the garden. He looked at the pruning shears in her hand as though noticing them for the first time, or perhaps noticing for the first time what it meant that she was holding them. "I heard about this place," he said. "In town. I stopped at the hardware store to ask for directions, and the man at the counter knew exactly what I was describing. He said Ward's cabin and gave me directions before I finished the sentence." Evelyn waited. "He said people come from as far as Burlington." Douglas glanced again at the jars on the table. "I didn't think it would be this." "You didn't think about it at all," she said. "That's why it's still here." He absorbed this without argument, which was new. The Douglas she had been married to had a reflexive resistance to any statement that reframed a situation in a way that did not advantage him. The man standing at the edge of her garden seemed to have lost access to that reflex, or perhaps to have understood recently that it had been costing him more than it was earning. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Since October." 4 months. He said it as though he were checking arithmetic. "Alone?" "No," she said, "not alone." He looked toward the tree line as though expecting to see someone there. "Who else is here?" "No one right now. But Pete Dawson comes 3 times a week. Carol Whitfield comes on Thursdays. Meg Calloway was here last weekend." She paused. "I have a signed supply contract with Harold Stinson Stores. I have 4 regular walk-in customers from the county who come on their own schedule and 3 who call ahead." She was not telling him this to impress him. She was telling him because it was true, and because she understood now that the true account of a life told plainly is more powerful than any argument. Something moved through his face. Not quite surprised, because she thought on some level he had known he would find her upright. Something more complicated. The specific expression of a man confronting the distance between what he had assumed and what is. "I came because I wanted to talk," he said. "I gathered that." He was quiet for a moment. Behind him, the late afternoon light was going the way it went in November in Vermont, which was faster and more decisively than in any other month, as though the sun had somewhere else to be. She set the pruning shears on the garden wall and walked toward the porch, not toward him, but to the side, placing herself between him and the cabin door in a way that was instinct more than intention. "The house," he said, "the Burlington house, the costs are higher than I planned for." "I know." He blinked. "You know? Carol told me. She sold her house on Elmwood in September. She mentioned that maintenance on those properties is substantial when you're managing it yourself." A beat. "I managed ours for 47 years. I didn't charge for it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down, and she saw something cross his face that she had not expected to see. Not regret exactly, because Douglas did not traffic in regret in any form she had been able to identify in 48 years. Something more unfamiliar. The expression of a man recognizing, perhaps for the first time, the full dimensions of what he had believed he was paying for. Sandra left, he said. I know that too. In February? Yes. He looked up. Is there anything I'm going to say that you don't already know? Probably not, she said. But say it anyway, it might help you. He put his hands back in his pockets. She could see him arranging himself, looking for the structure of the conversation he had come here to have. The one where he offered something and she responded, and they arrived at a resolution that cost him something manageable. He had always thought in terms of structures. It had made him a very good engineer. It had made him a particular kind of husband. I thought I could sell the Burlington house, he said, divide the proceeds, not through the courts, just between us. A private arrangement, he paused, to correct things. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, looking at him. The cold was coming in earnest now, the temperature dropping in the hour before dark the way it dropped in November, quickly and with commitment. Douglas, she said, you took the house because the court said you could. You took the car because it was in your name. You took the bank account because you had structured it so that you could. And then you handed me an envelope with $3,200 and told me to take care of myself. She said this without anger because the anger had processed itself out of her system somewhere around the third week in that cabin, somewhere between the first night she successfully lit the wood stove and the morning she finished reading her mother's second notebook, and understood what Francis Ward had understood, that the energy spent on bitterness is energy that cannot be spent on anything that actually grows. You don't owe me money now. What happened in October was legal. It was also wrong. Those two things are both true and they don't cancel each other out. But neither one of them is why you're here. He watched her. He did not interrupt, which was also new. You're here because you did something you were certain about, and it turned out you were not as certain as you thought. And the part that unsettles you is not the house or the month or Sandra leaving. The part that unsettles you is that you looked at me for 48 years and decided you knew exactly what I was and what I was capable of and what I needed. And you were wrong about all of it. She stepped up onto the first porch step so that she was looking at him at eye level rather than slightly upward. That's what you came here to find out. Whether you were wrong. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said very quietly, I didn't know you could do any of this. I know you didn't. The business, the contracts, any of it, I know. How is that possible? And he sounded genuinely perplexed, the bewilderment of an engineer who has encountered a load-bearing element he had not accounted for in his original design. We lived in the same house. We did, she said. But you watch me run the house the way you watch something that runs correctly. You notice it when it stops. You don't ask how it works. She paused. I didn't ask either for a long time. It took coming here to remember that I had always known. Douglas looked past her at the sign above the porch. Ward's cabin. He looked at it for several seconds. You used your name, he said. I used my name. I was Ward before I was Hart. It turns out Ward is the part that was doing most of the work. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched something move through him, some internal reckoning that she could not fully see and did not need to. He had his own accounting to do, and it was his to do alone, and whatever he arrived at on the other side of it was no longer her responsibility to shape or absorb. I made a mistake, he said finally. Not, I'm sorry, not forgive me, because Douglas Hart did not know how to say those things any more than he had ever known how to say them. And she had stopped waiting for it so long ago that the absence of it did not register as loss anymore. But I made a mistake from this man in this moment was the closest thing to genuine reckoning she had heard from him in a decade, and she accepted it for what it was. Yes, she said, you did. He nodded slowly. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out the envelope the same size and weight as the one he had handed her in the Burlington driveway in October, and he held it out toward her. She looked at it, but did not take it. I mailed your money back to you in November, she said. All of it. I don't need it. This is different, he said. It's not about what you need. He paused. It's about what was taken. She looked at him for a long moment. At the face she had shared a life with older, now carrying in its lines the record of everything they had been to each other, which had included at different times something very good and something very damaging, and much of the long, ordinary space between those two things that constitutes most of a life. Keep it, she said. The Burlington house will cost you more than you expect, and you'll need it more than I will. She stepped back toward the door. Take care of yourself, Douglas. I mean that. Not the way you said it to me in October as a closing remark. I mean it the way you'd say it to someone you once knew very well and hope finds their way. He stood for another moment with the envelope in his hand, and she could see him looking for something else to say, some other structure to propose, some other arrangement to offer. But he had run through what he had come with, and she was not going to give him more to respond to because the conversation was finished, and they both understood it. He put the envelope back in his pocket. Your mother would have liked this, he said, gesturing vaguely at the cabin, the garden, the sign. She built it, Evelyn said. I just came back to it. She went inside and closed the door. Not with force, not with ceremony. She simply pulled it closed until the latch caught, and then she stood in the center of her mother's cabin with her hands at her sides and listened to the quiet. She heard his footsteps on the gravel, uneven, slower than she remembered. She heard the car door, the engine starting, that smooth, expensive hum, and then it faded, moving back along the dirt road through the pines and out to the county road, and then it was gone entirely, and there was nothing but the sound of the wood stove working in the corner and the wind in the spruce, and somewhere distantly, Pete's truck on the neighboring property doing something that required backing up and going forward and backing up again. Carol arrived 40 minutes later with a bag of groceries from the Milbrook market and the unapologetic efficiency of a woman who has recently discovered that she finds purpose in being useful to someone she actually respects. She set the bag on the kitchen table and began unpacking it without asking whether Evelyn wanted her to, which was how their arrangement had evolved over the preceding months into something comfortable and genuine, in a friendship built not from shared history, but from shared circumstance, and the discovery that the person across the table had more interior dimension than either of them had realized. I saw the sedan on my way in, Carol said. Dark blue, Vermont plates. Yes, Douglas. Yes. Carol set a jar of honey on the table and looked at Evelyn. Are you all right? Evelyn considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I am, she said. I've been all right for a while now. I don't think I noticed exactly when it happened. Carol nodded and continued unpacking the groceries and did not ask anything further because she had learned by now that Evelyn would say what she needed to say and leave out what she didn't, and that both the saying and the leaving out were intentional, and that respecting the difference was the more important thing. They made dinner together in the small kitchen the way they had done on Thursdays for 3 months now. Carol handling the things that required standing for long periods, and Evelyn sitting at the table doing the things that could be done, sitting a practical division arrived at without discussion. After Carol noticed one evening that Evelyn's right knee was troubling her, and Evelyn noticed that Carol had been quietly compensating for it ever since, the arrangement had not been named. It didn't need to be. After dinner, Evelyn took the cedar box from its place on the shelf beside the fireplace and set it on the table. She had been intending to do this for some time, since the night she had finally read the letter in the sealed envelope, since the night she had sat on the floor with her mother's words in her hands and understood that the thing she had been given was not a place but a permission. She opened the lid. Carol watched from across the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Evelyn lifted out the bundle of her mother's letters, the photographs, the old estate documents. And then from the bottom of the box, she took out the folded piece of paper, the one with Francis's phone number and Meg Calloway's name, the one she had read on the curb in Burlington in October. She unfolded it and smoothed it flat on the table. My mother wrote this in 1987, she said. The same year she transferred the cabin to me. She put it in this box knowing I might not find it for decades, if ever. She looked at it. She knew I would need a place to stand, and she made one, and then she waited to see if I'd come to it. Carol looked at the paper. She never told you. She never told me. She told Meg. She arranged the taxes so the property wouldn't be lost. She left the key and the note and the notebook under the floorboard, and she trusted that if I needed it badly enough, I would find it. Evelyn folded the paper again carefully. I was angry about that for a few weeks. In the early part of November, I kept thinking she should have told me, should have said something, should have at least hinted. I had 43 years I could have been thinking about this place. But, Carol said, but if she had told me, I would have thought about it as a backup, an option, an alternative, a contingency, and I would have used it that way probably. I would have come here when things got difficult in my marriage, and I would have spent a weekend here and driven back to Burlington thinking I had a plan, and that the plan's existence meant I didn't have to use it yet. She paused. Instead, I had nothing. And when I had nothing, I remembered the key. And when I came here with nothing, I had to build something real because there was no going back to call an option on. She looked at the cedar box. She was smarter about me than I was about myself. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my mother was like that about me too. Quiet about the important things. I used to think it was withholding. Now I think she was just waiting to see who I'd turn out to be before she decided what I needed to hear. Evelyn looked at her. In October, she had not trusted Carol had seen her as a peripheral figure in Douglas's orbit, someone who had chosen comfort over honesty when it mattered. What had changed was not that Carol had apologized, though she had, or that she had proven herself useful, though she had done that too. What had changed was that Evelyn had come to understand that most people are not malicious. They are afraid and fearful people make the calculation of the moment, and the calculation of the moment is rarely the calculation that serves the person who needed them most. Understanding this did not erase the fact of it. It simply made it something she could work with rather than something she had to carry. Stay in Milbrook, Evelyn said. It was not a request and it was not a suggestion. It came out as a simple statement, the way statements come out when you have thought about them enough that they've become obvious. Carol looked at her. I've been looking at a property on Route 8. I know, Meg told me. Carol laughed, which was a sound Evelyn had come to enjoy. A full, unself-conscious laugh that Carol had apparently kept stored away during the decades she had spent being a certain kind of person in a certain kind of neighborhood. Does Meg tell you everything? She tells me what she thinks I need to know. She's very good at it. They sat for a while longer, finishing their tea, while the wood stove held the cold at bay and the wind moved through the trees outside with the particular patient persistence of Vermont November, which does not howl or threaten, but simply settles in making itself at home, reminding you of what season it is. After Carol left, Evelyn moved to the table by the east window, the one she thought of as her mother's table because Frances had always preferred the east light for detail work, claiming it was more honest than the afternoon light, which flattered things. She had moved the old wooden table from the center of the room to this position in her second week here, trusting the instinct and finding when she sat at it in the mornings that her mother had been right. She took from the shelf a blank notebook she had bought at the Milbrook stationery shop. She opened it to the first page and set it flat in front of her. She wrote her name in the upper right corner, the way she had been taught in school, the way she had signed every letter and document and card for 7 decades. But she wrote it differently than she had in 50 years. She wrote Evelyn Ward Hart, both names. The one before and the one after together on the same line, neither one crossing out the other. She looked at it for a moment. Then she began to write. She wrote what had happened beginning from the Tuesday morning in October when the moving truck arrived. She wrote it plainly and in order because that was how she had always thought most clearly, and because the habit of her mother's notebooks had taught her over the preceding months that a clear account of what has happened is worth more practically and otherwise than any amount of reflection about what it meant. Meaning she had come to believe arrives on its own schedule and in its own form, and you cannot rush it by staring at it directly. But she was not writing only a record. She understood that as she wrote the way you understand something mid-sentence that you did not know when the sentence began. She was writing the thing her mother had written in a different form for a different time, the accumulated knowledge of a woman who had stood at the bottom of a very steep hill and climbed it, and who now knew which parts of the climb were harder than they looked and which were easier, and where the ground was loose and where it held. Her mother had written for her. She was writing for someone she did not know yet, for a daughter or a granddaughter or a neighbor's daughter or a stranger who would stand in a driveway one day holding an envelope and two suitcases and not know which direction to walk. She wrote for 3 hours. The wood stove settled into its late-night rhythm, ticking quietly as the temperature outside dropped. The wind off the hills had stilled by midnight, leaving the kind of silence that only exists in rural Vermont. In deep winter, a silence so complete that you can hear your own heart if you choose to listen for it. She did not choose to listen for it. She was busy writing. In the spring, when the ground softened enough to work and the herb beds began to show their first green, and Pete arrived on Tuesdays and Thursdays with his truck and his particular economy of speech that she had come to rely on, the way you rely on a good tool, the notebook was half full. She had not planned for that. She had simply written when she had something to write, which turned out to be most evenings. Meg came in April to deliver the completed legal file the cabin's ownership documented and protected to a standard that would survive any challenge from any direction. She sat at the table by the east window and drank coffee while Evelyn signed the final documents, reading each one first, every clause of every page the way she read everything now. "Harold wants to expand the order again," Meg said when the signing was done. "I know. He sent a letter. He also mentioned that he's looking for someone to manage the specialty food section of the Milbrook store." Meg looked at her carefully. "He didn't come out and say it directly, but I think he was wondering whether you might know someone." Evelyn looked at her. "Tell him to call Carol Whitfield. She's on Route 8 now. She's been asking about a project." Meg wrote it down. Then she closed her folder and looked at the notebook on the shelf, the one Evelyn had been filling through the winter. "What is that?" "Notes," Evelyn said, "for whoever needs them next." Meg considered this. "You're writing what your mother wrote." "I'm writing what I know. My mother wrote what she knew. They're different books." Meg nodded slowly, the nod of a lawyer who has seen enough human situations to understand that the things people leave behind are always in some form continuations. She left around noon. Evelyn stood on the porch and watched her car disappear down the dirt road. And then she stood a moment longer in the April air, which carried the first genuine warmth of the season, the particular quality of warmth that means something is beginning rather than ending. The garden was waking up. The old apple tree at the back corner of the property, the one she had not known was there until February, when Pete pointed it out, had begun to bud. There were 12 jars of the spring's first preserved batch on the shelf inside strawberry and early rhubarb, and there was an order from Harold for 20 more by the following Friday. She had things to do. She went inside, poured herself a cup of coffee, sat down at the east window, and opened the notebook to where she had left off the night before. Outside, the apple tree moved slightly in the April wind, its new leaves catching the morning light, small and green, and entirely certain about what they were becoming. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "The key will fit. Trust it." Then she continued where she had left off, writing plainly, and in order the way her mother had taught her, which was to say she wrote what was true, left out what was not, and let the difference speak for itself.